You know, a lot of times people will actually, they will notice that somebody goes to a psychologist and they'll go for years and they don't get any better, and very often they get worse. Or they go to a psychologist and next thing you know they're engaging in all sorts of immoral behavior, or things get a little strange. And there's certain reasons for this which I think will be disclosed through the course of this talk, but there's certain things I would like to talk about before I explain why that happens to people, and also discuss the actual dangers of modern psychology. Usually when people see that I've written a 3-volume work on psychology, it's, you know, you kind of get into apologetic mode. You know, it's not like the other stuff out there, is what you want to tell people. But in order to kind of lay the groundwork, I'd like to start with a distinction which in the medieval period they used to make in every science. There are 3 constituents. That is what they call the material object, the formal object, and the method. The material object is the thing you're studying. So in the case of biology, you're studying, you know, living things and that kind of thing. In chemistry, you're studying chemicals and that type of thing. And then the formal object is the perspective that you take on it. So human beings can be studied from a biological point of view or from a chemical point of view, or they can also be studied from a theological or a philosophical point of view. So you can have the same material object but looked at from different points of view. And then, so as a result, you can have different sciences. And then that perspective that you take on it determines the method, because obviously the method that is used in biology is different from chemistry, is different from philosophy, is different from theology. And so the method is determined based upon the particular viewpoint you take in relationship to the thing you're studying. Now, the upshot of all this is that the sciences are not just the empirical sciences. A science is defined as an organized body of knowledge of things through their causes. In other words, I have a scientific knowledge about something because I know what causes it, what brings it into being, what affects it, that type of thing. Okay, well, what this means is in the context of psychology is that the Council of Vienna formally defined that a human being is a composite thing. He's composed of body and soul. And so we're not just strictly an animal. An animal is alive, but it doesn't have an immaterial soul, and so it's a little bit different. Also, there are certain operations which human beings perform which are immaterial. For example, there's certain kinds of thought that we can do. For example, just to reflect in upon yourself, think about your own thought, that type of thing. That's something that you'd hear a philosopher say, think about your own thought, you know. But, and also acts of the will, these are things that occur independently of matter. In other words, there's certain faculties, certain capacities we have to do certain things which are entirely immaterial. And then part of our intellect is also material, that is, we have a brain and that type of thing. And so the brain, or the intellect in man is a composite between the brain and a certain immaterial side of it. But what all of this ultimately means is that modern psychology doesn't understand its object of study. And the reason it doesn't understand it is because it assumes that the object that it studies is purely material. It puts away any concept of an immaterial soul. It tends to treat human beings like strictly like an animal. And so what they tend to think is that if you can just grasp the empirical scientific side of human beings, then you'll be able to explain everything that goes along with psychology. But that's the problem. We do perform certain operations. That is, freedom of choice. How do we know freedom of choice is not material? Well, because of the fact that physical laws always determine physical outcomes of things. Whereas freedom of choice, it can go one way or another, so it's not predetermined. And so the capacity for us to choose one thing over another is a sign that it's not bound by matter, because otherwise we would always choose the same thing under the same set of circumstances, and that's not always true with human beings. So the formal object, so the object of study ultimately is man, intellectually. That is, what constitutes the right functioning of his intellect. And then the formal object is looking from his intellect, and then it's looked at from the point of view. So the formal object is the perspective that we take on it, which is his health, his mental health. And by health we mean that his intellect operates rightly, that it functions properly. The method, therefore, depends upon the formal object, but that means, therefore, you can't have a purely empirical science regarding human psychology. Because there are certain immaterial operations that we perform, certain immaterial acts, like certain kinds of thinking, like the concept of truth is something that we grasp immaterially. You know, you don't see the actual truth going down the street, you know, there goes truth, because truth is something which we know independently of matter, and so, because there's not a material thing called truth. So, that means, therefore, that when you're looking at studying human psychology, you have to look at it from the right point of view, otherwise you're just going to get things wrong. And that's what modern psychology has done. They have treated man in such a way that he's not viewed as having an immaterial soul or any type of immaterial operations, and so they tend to look at him from a purely material point of view, and that has determined their method. So their method is one of the empirical sciences, so they try and measure it, measure his reactions. They try and figure out biochemically, if we can just manipulate the biochemistry in his brain, the person will be perfectly healthy, which I'll have a few things to say about that later. But in point and fact, we know that that's not always the case. You can put people on medications and they don't seem to get too much better in certain circumstances. But in point and fact, there are certain things that we do. There's certain freedom of choice. One of the things they've discovered, too, is that you can actually change the material disposition of your brain, the material operations in your brain, just by the choice that you make in your behavior. And this is something that they've known. You know, if you think a lot of depressing thoughts, your brain begins to adjust itself. That's a dictum in the scholastic age, that the body adjusts itself to the operations of the soul. So that means if you think depressing thoughts, your brain adjusts itself so it can be depressed all the time. And then they say, well, see, depression is a material problem. No, it's not. That can be part of it. It could be the type of thing that someone has an indisposition, but in a lot of cases it's the particular choices that they've made that have led to this kind of a thing. They've also discovered the same thing with lying, that lying actually changes the brain structure, the actual wiring in your brain. The other thing they've discovered too, and this is one of the reasons why I tell people keep your children away from television, they have found that children who watch large amounts of television, 2 to 3 hours a day, under the age of 5, it will cause brain damage, because of the fact that the brain at that stage is not wired to handle the rapidity of the images that occur on a television. So it's another good reason to read a book rather than to watch television. But the point in all of this is because modern psychology looks at human beings as purely material, it means that most of modern psychology it's not a valid science. Because in order to be a valid science, you have to have a knowledge of the thing through its causes. Well, the fact of the matter is there are certain immaterial causes and certain things that occur in us immaterially which cannot be empirically measured, which is what they've tried to actually take. And historically, up until the advent of modern psychologists like Freud and the like, psychology was always considered a philosophical science because of the fact that there were these operations which we perform which are immaterial. But then when certain people came along and just considered us an advanced animal, they figured, oh no, it can be just empirical science, and then that's the end of it. And then because of that view, they've changed their methodology. So their mode of proceeding in the psychology has been an abysmal failure. And this is the thing that's happened. One of the things that they've done is because of the fact that they got off on the wrong footing, and because they don't understand how beings are designed and how they function and the interrelationship between their faculties, like their emotions and their intellect and things of that sort, because they don't understand these things, it's been an abysmal failure. I mean, their success rate in California, they decided to do a study, and they took 1,000 people off the street that had psychological difficulties, and they put them in front of psychologists, and they noted the success rate. And then they took people just off the street and said, put them in front of the person that was mentally ill and says, here, help this individual. The people off the street had a far higher success rate than the trained psychologists. And that actually tells you something. It tells you they don't know what they're doing. You know, if I go and I study if I go to study what it is to be a veterinarian, and then somebody sticks me in front of a car and then tells me, okay, now help this person, I'm going to be a disaster. I'm not going to know what I'm doing. I'm going to start pulling wires and things aren't going to run right and that type of thing. And that's what's happened in modern psychology. The empirical method cannot deal with free will and intellectual knowledge, and so they treat him like a man. John Watson in his text, Psychology as the Behavioralist Views It, says, quote, "The behavioralist, in his efforts to get a unitary scheme of animal response, recognizes no dividing line between man and brute." So in other words, usually most psychologists tend to think us as advanced animals. In addition, there's a systematic rejection of God. And this is partly due to the fact that many of the psychologists were immoral men. If you want to know the lifestyles of people like Freud and Jung and the like, you can read Libido Dominandi and Degenerate Moderns by E. Michael Jones. And they'll give you an insight into why these people began promoting certain things in their psychology and why they tended to ignore things like God or just act like God didn't exist and things of that sort. Jung makes the observation that in his 2 essays on analytical psychology, he says, quote, "Simple-minded people have, of course, never separated these things from an individual consciousness, because the projection of gods, demons, etc. has not been understood as a psychological function, but the projections have simply been acceptances of reality, that is, they accepted them as realities, and their true character never recognized. Not till the age of enlightenment was it discovered that the gods did not really exist, but were only projections. They were disposed of, but the psychological function which corresponds to them was by no means disposed of," unquote. In other words, what he's saying is, now remember, Jung is one of the principal influences of convents in the last 40 years, that there was no God, there was no immortal soul, and that this was all just a projection of man's desires or wants or needs or what he thinks, and so these things didn't really exist. That means if you take that perspective on human beings, it's going to determine how you psychologically form them. For example, let's say suppose somebody undergoes an abortion. Now, one of the things they've found is that most women, the trauma in abortion is so severe, it usually takes 8 to 10 years for them to really come to terms with it. And that was one of the difficulties that they had in some of the studies, is the fact that it was hard to get a real read on the psychological health of women after abortion because of the fact that it took years for the women to actually come to a reckoning in relationship to it. But they would feel guilty very often, and what modern psychology would do is try and say, well, there's no reason to feel guilty. There's no God, there's no such thing as really morality. This is just something that you did, and so don't worry about it. Just move on with your life and accept that this is just the way things are. And so in the end, they don't really help people because why? Human beings have a natural inclination to guilt when they do something wrong. They have in other words, it's built into our very structure by God to want to worship Him, to want to have communion with saints and angels and things of this sort. Now, it takes revelation for us to know how that all works. But we have these natural inclinations towards that, and modern psychology has thwarted those things, and it's made people feel even worse. And usually when, my experience is usually when modern psychologists get done with most people, they're usually worse off than when they started. In fact, one of the modern psychology has not produced what it claims, that is mental health. The success rate of your average psychologist is less than 10%. Less than 10%. That's the success rate of your average psychologist. If he uses drugs, it's a little bit higher. But this often just merely masks the problem, and it doesn't really solve the problem. And to see, the fact that there hasn't been much success, you can read the book Psychological Seduction by William Kilpatrick. And he also has another one called The Emperor's New Clothing, which tells the story, and this is just, it talks about the fact that there has not been much success rate among them. Modern psychology is not scientific because it was or is an empirical. It's not empirical scientific. It is. It would produce the effect of mental health, much like empirical scientists can produce experiments in their lab. In other words, just as a chemist can take oxygen and hydrogen, put flame to it, and it'll explode. In other words, and they can do this consistently. If, in fact, psychology was an empirical science, they should be able to produce the same kinds of effects repeatedly in people, and they can't, which is a sign that it's not an empirical science. And this brings up fraud. The fact of the matter is, and it's kind of funny, Freud used to refer to his patients as goldfish, because once you got them on the line, you just bilked them financially. He admitted this. And that in fact, one of the things that psychologists very often do is they will try not to make the person better, because the longer you keep them on the line, the more secure your job is. And there was a priest one time who told the story of the fact that there was a man who was in a war in Vietnam, and he had real difficulties, and so he said, look, I'd like you to go to this Catholic psychologist, and the guy was there for 7 months, but the priest said, because he doesn't have any money, I'll pay for it. He said, well, this is starting to get kind of expensive. So he told the psychologist, he said, can you kind of hurry this along? It's taking a little while. Well, 3 weeks later, the guy was cured, quote unquote. So the moral of the story is that there's a question of fraud. If they can't produce what they say, then why are they saying that they can do it? In fact, most psychologists tend to make people more dependent on them rather than psychologically healthy, which makes people more self-sufficient and independent of them. Then it is not scientific because it does not take into consideration the causes of mental health or illness because of its empirical method. And there's certain things that affect our mental health. For example, demonic activity. Not all people who are mentally ill are demonically influenced, but demons can influence people psychologically. There's a thing called obsession, where they can barrage the person's thoughts, that is, if God allows it. They can barrage the person's thoughts, and the person literally can, lose a certain amount of control over himself psychologically. There's also God. God can influence us through grace. That is, he can cure people. There's also sin. Sin has certain effects, one of which is darkening of the intellect, which we all learned from our Baltimore Catechism. And so the more you sin, the more likely you become, or the more prone you become to psychological illness. Then there's, of course, angels. Angels can actually help you to become psychologically healthy, or help you to maintain it. So the point is that there's certain things that can affect certain causes of our mental health, which they preclude. Now, if they preclude them, then how can they make the claim to know the causes of mental health? In other words, how can they make a claim to be scientific? So when you boil it all down to it, because they don't even understand their object of inquiry, that is, the human intellect, and because they don't understand the various causes that can go into it, they don't really have a claim to it being scientific, ultimately. In other words, their claim of, we're an empirical science, this is all very... It's not a true claim, and the proof in the pudding, as I mentioned, is they can't produce what they claim. Modern psychology is dangerous because it was founded by atheists and agnostics who deny God and see the explanations of religion putting aside natural law, that is, aside from God designing us in a certain way and things of that sort. Modern psychology is also very dangerous because it encourages sin. For example, they'll often say, very Freudian, that most psychological problems is because it's a frustrated sexual libido. And so you just have to give free rein to that and then you'll be fine. Well, and this is why very often they'll encourage people to engage in things like self-abuse, sodomy, and the things of that sort. In fact, many of you might have heard, there's a book called the DSM-4, which gives a list of all of the psychological illnesses and their causes and effects and what to do with it, etc. But homosexuality was removed from it a little while ago. And there's been a big push. I think they even removed pedophilia from it. And this is a story which most people don't know. In fact, I was telling people this the night before. I was watching TV one time, and when I was watching it, I was starting to look for a gun. I was getting so irritated because of the fact that there was a bishop on the television who said that the problem wasn't the fact that the priests were pedophiles. The problem was that the victims squealed. Now think of what that means. Now, you need to understand a bit behind that. He was telling you what the psychologists had told the bishops in closed session when the pedophilia scandal broke. Because the psychologists for years had been telling people pedophilia is a perfectly natural behavior. We just have to get people accustomed to accepting it. And that's a sign. That tells you the danger of it. On the flip side of this, and I can tell you this not only because I've written books on psychology, but because I deal with the fallout as a priest, the fact that molestation for people who are younger is very damaging psychologically. It takes years for people very often to get straightened out from it. So what are some of the practical dangers? Psychology seems to affect almost every aspect of the church. I mean, most of you probably know that already. Homilies today are more concerned about people's feelings than the teaching of doctrine. Pastoral theology used to be about the administration of the sacraments and and the spiritual side of things. That is, how to tell people how to get to heaven. I mean, that if you read the pastoral theology books, the books that are labeled pastoral theology from before about 1950, they all almost deal with the administration of the sacraments and certain aspects of the spiritual life. But that all shifted now to where pastoral theology is all psychology. This has left a gap in most priests' knowledge of the proper way to lead people to heaven by the right administration of the sacraments and other elements of sanctification. And so very often priests come out of the seminary and they don't even know the basic of the mechanics of the spiritual life. In fact, in the Diocese of Lincoln, which is considered one of the most healthy dioceses as far as the presbyterate goes, I gave just some basic things on how the gifts of the Holy Ghost affect us psychologically. And at the end of it, some of the priests were stunned. They said, "You know, we didn't know any of this." They're sent to decent seminaries, so it's even worked into even some of the good seminaries. Seminary formation, that is their character formation, that is what they consider good and bad, as well as their intellectual formation is heavily imbued with psychology. And what does this mean about our future clergy? I mean, most of them know more about, modern psychology than they actually do about what the saints say on how to save your soul. The governance with the church is more concerned with how people accept the teaching rather than the teaching of the truth. As I mentioned, the pedophilia scandal is the product of modern psychologists saying that it's not a problem. Moral teachings and practice have collapsed because modern psychology does not give full recognition to the natural law or to religion, which would teach a proper code of conduct. Then this is particularly the case again in the area of the Sixth Commandment. In other words, there is a real problem because psychology has gotten into the morality. It's not an issue of morality. It's not about teaching people the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. It's really just about teaching people to come into communion with their emotions and how to get along with people, not to hurt people, help people to feel emotionally happy and things of that sort amongst each other, rather than charity. I mean, if you ask the average person what charity is, they usually, the first word will be out of, you got to be nice. Well, that's not the traditional understanding of it. The traditional, even though meekness, which is also sometimes labeled as mildness, is part of charity. But charity is love of God and love of neighbor for the sake of God, and we all know this with children. There's certain times you can't be nice to them if you're going to ultimately be charitable to them. In other words, if you really love them, you have to discipline them. So in other words, it's even affected our moral teaching within the church. The other problem is I mentioned immanentism last night. And immanentism is, again, the philosophy which tends to make ourselves the principle of judgment about what is right and wrong and what to do, what we think about God. And that means, and this is what happened, the philosophers after Kant said that basically taking Descartes, because Descartes said, the first thing I know is my own thought. And then he says, and then I know reality. Well, that makes my own thought the principle of judgment of, what I think, ultimately, and not what's real. Kant comes along and says, well, I can't even know reality. So really what I'm left is in my own thought. Then what happens is Kant says, well, the only way you can really know God is he's outside of us. So in the end, I can't really know God, and so they usually credit Kant with the credit of being the father of modern atheism. But the upshot to that means that religion gets transposed, what religious doctrine gets transposed from reality to interiorly, and that means that religion really gets boiled down to psychology, because it's really about my psychological reaction, what I think about it, and that type of thing that is really the important factor, rather than some objective teaching that's taught to me by a magisterium. And so as long as immanentism reigns in the church, we're always going to be dominated by this psychological approach in pastoral theology. Modern psychology is now accepted by the legal system, which is why it is possible to lock people up who are religious or things of this sort. They say, oh, these people are nuts, And I think people are starting to see that more and more, especially in relationship to the whole schooling thing, like in California and in Germany. Basically the state wants certain control, and usually that means that they want to be able to indoctrinate your children, that is, apply certain psychological methods to your children in school, which they can't do if you have them at home. The legal system is a conundrum, because psychologists cannot come to a consensus because the psychologists don't know what is their proper object. They can't agree on what makes you healthy. They can't even, do you know there is not a single psychological manual produced today that will give you a definition of mental health, save the one that's over on that table over there with my name on it. No, but that is a real serious thing. I started digging around to try and find, when I was writing these things, I want to say, well, I want to see what they say the definition of mental health is. Not a single one. They'll give certain descriptions of certain things, but they'll never give you a definition of it. Now, if you can't even define the thing, upon what basis do you have to sit in a court and tell them that this guy is healthy or not? You can't even define it. Now, if I was a lawyer, I'd be making all sorts of hay over that one. And then so they drag them in as an expert testimony, and then what happens? Well, then the defense side brings in their expert, and before you know it, nobody knows what's going on because nobody can agree on what constitutes whether this guy is really insane or not. Because of the views of modern psychology on children, they are permitted to sue their parents now. Then there's the impact statements by victims in courts. Now, sometimes those can have a proper place, but they're often just imbued with just an emotional, sappy, psychological approach in order to maximize the damages so that they can receive more money or things of this sort. So instead of looking at things objectively, I mean, I can see that, they would need the judge or whoever assigns the sentence should sit down with the family and find out, okay, what has really happened here to the family and that type of thing. And that's because it's necessary to get an objective analysis of this. But when it's just this sappy, sentimental thing, it's all about who can massage the right people at the right time psychologically in order to get the emotional effect they want. The use of modern psychology and understanding psychological illness has occurred in order to avoid prosecution. Some guy will claim, oh, I'm psychologically ill. And then they'll go find some manual who says, oh yes, if this happens to a person at this age, then he's psychologically unhealthy, even though there's nothing wrong with the individual. Then there's modern educational methods, which are thoroughly imbued with modern psychological approach. There is the whole problem, of course, of self-esteem in modern psychological circles, and how this has actually degraded academic standards. Nothing drives me more nuts. I always tell people, even though I have 6 degrees, I tell them I shouldn't have probably hardly any of them, because of the fact that part of this is because of the fact that I grew up in a family where most of my siblings were far more intelligent than I was. So that always kind of keeps a person humble, of course. But in the past, the academic standards, most people barely finished high school, if that. And then out of that, only a few were suggested, you're very bright, maybe you should go on to get a degree in college. And then out of those, maybe 1 in 50 went on to get their master's. And then out of those, maybe 1 in 20 got a doctorate. Well, now we all know doctorates are a dime a dozen. And that's because the academic standards are so low that the cream of the crop, as my cousin says, it's no longer the cream of the crop at the top. When he got his doctorate in biochemistry, I said, well, congratulations. He says, it doesn't mean anything. He says, all it means is I stuck around long enough for them to get sick of me and give me the degree. And then I started reflecting on that. Yeah, there's a lot of people that are in these academic programs. But the thing is that the psychology has brought this about. Why? You can't hurt people's feelings because you'll cause them psychological trauma. So yes, 2 + 2 = 5 is perfectly fine, Johnny. Here's your star and go home. It's that kind of a thing. But then there's also the problem of self-esteem. Once in a while I'll get people to come to me, for spiritual advice, and they'll say, Father, I really suffer from low self-esteem. I say, good. That's a good thing. And then there's usually stand back, and I said, and this is why. Because, as we all know from the teachings of the saints, any bad thing that's in us is our own fault, and anything good is the result of God working through us. So if there's anything to be esteemed, it's what God is working through us. So, and that's, the point is that you should, when we look at ourselves, we realize how wretched we truly are, and that's called truth. And that's the thing, one of the things that modern psychology hasn't gotten a hold of. I had this one professor, he comes into class and he says, they're teaching pride in the universities now, and they call it self-esteem. And that doesn't mean, of course, that you go around, denying the virtues or the perfections you have. It's just that whenever you look at them, you must always refer them back to God, because otherwise you'll think a bit too highly of yourself. But this whole thing of, the big book, the book about, Johnny can't read and all these problems that are occurring because, 2 + 2 doesn't really equal 5, even though that's what they're telling people, is, as I tell people, yet another reason to homeschool your child. TV and modern practices of advertising are thoroughly imbued with behavioralism. You know, the United States really took what Watson said, hook, line, and sinker. And what Watson did is Watson discovered that there is a mechanism in human beings, it's only a part of it, that there's this thing called association. So if you put one thing next to another thing, we'll make this association, right? Well, this is why you have the beautiful, scantily clad girl standing next to the beer, and then the guy thinks, oh, yes, I'd like that beer. Well, the point being in all this is that in the United States, we realized that that is a great marketing tool, and Watson made his money off of being a consultant for advertising firms or getting that kind of thing off the ground. And so that has affected virtually everything from the advertising to TV. TV has become particularly good at making, you know, they'll get the person who's had an abortion or something really bad, or they're living in a really bad state, but they're suffering and they're really trying, and so there's this spin put on it, and so they look like they're really good people and that type of thing, and so they're really good at massaging this side of our psychology. And this is very dangerous. This is another reason I tell people, keep your kid away from the TV. Then there's the government using modern psychology in order to do social engineering. For example, this is seen in the role of sex education and now global warming, although I do like the fact that because the global temperatures were down globally last year, surprise, they're now calling it global climate change. So, but it's this: they use the ecological things, and don't get me wrong, I totally agree with Holy Father. You take care of the environment because we're good stewards of it, and because if you don't, it affects other people, and that's why you take care of it. Not because it's an end in itself, but because it's there for our use. And it's just a matter of being prudent. But on the other hand, you know, it's one of those things that they use these things to try and manipulate people's behavior. Global warming, you can't drive, you can't drive, you can't drive, you know, that type of thing. They're also affecting people's understanding of the family unit and the role of women in society. And so it's affecting us on a variety of different levels. In families, you have the Dr. Spock approach to children discipline. Never mind the fact that God told us, spare the rod, spoil the child. I mean, it's God, the one who designed it. Here's the manual on how to take care of your kid. And then we ignore that and follow Dr. Spock, who says you should never discipline your child because it's bad. And then, of course, they do these studies and say, oh, spanking leads to problems later. Yeah, well, there's a problem with the control group in those studies, or they tend to focus on certain things. And this is one of the things why modern studies, especially the stuff that's based on statistics, you can get almost anything you want out of these studies anymore, depending on how you control the situation or to control the questions or things of this sort. This is a sign that people are listening actually more to psychologists than God, partly due to the fact that modern psychologists have inserted themselves in the place of God. In fact, B.F. Skinner in the book Walden 2 basically considers himself the Messiah, that if people will just simply follow me, I will cure everything. The role children play within the family insofar as there is exaggerated attention given to what they want, never mind what they need morally, spiritually, or psychologically. Then there's the modern psychology has waged a systematic war against the traditional family hierarchy and unit. And this came in the way of blaming parents for everything. You know, sometimes people come to me and they're like 25 and my parents did this, my parents did that. I'm like, I don't care. You know, you're an adult. It's time. You can now make you, out of yourself, what you want. You know, there's that whole thing. It's based on, actually, it's based on Thomism. That John Paul II writes this thing called the acting person. He says, you know, that we can actually determine what we become through our actions. And this is something that modern psychology has taken away from people. Oh, it was your environment, and because your parents were bad, this is why you're such a basket case. No, you're a basket case because you chose to go out and live immorally, is very often what you have to tell people. And this is also another sign that they're denying free will, but there has been this erosion of the family unit and an attack on the authority and the hierarchical structure within the family, particularly against parents. So what does this mean? Well, virtually every aspect of modern life is now imbued with modern psychological manipulation. Parents, I think, need to be really aware of this if you aren't already. So how do you avoid it? Well, it's quite simple. First, turn off the TV when you got children. That's the first thing. The second thing is homeschool, because you can determine what your children actually learn and how they learn it. The second thing is, and this is something that most people don't know, the Catholic Church, and this is one of the beauties of the documents, even in the last 40 to 50 years, they used to refer to the Church as the expert on humanity. The Church has built into its teaching, because God directs it and guides it, and it's also the case in Revelation, that, as John Paul II says, God reveals man to himself. In other words, we're a bit of a mystery to ourselves because original sin dumbed us down significantly. And so God had to come and say, look, you're not doing this quite right. This is how it functions. So the upshot of it is this. If you follow the traditional Catholic teachings about morality, because the morality will help people to think the right things, that is, custody the mind, keep your mind off certain things, that type of thing. It will teach you the right mode of conduct. It will teach you, if you just follow the traditional Catholic moral teachings, and if you follow the spirituality as is delineated by the lives of the saints, and you lead a good moral Catholic life, because of that, the whole deposit of faith, grace builds on nature. The whole deposit of faith which the Church has received from God is built directly on human nature. So it perfects it. So if you simply follow the Catholic teachings, you will be mentally healthy, generally speaking, unless there's some physiological cause. But, and that's one of the things too, is keep your children, generally speaking, away from psychologists. Why? Because the paradigm shift, because psychology has been abysmal failure, the shift has been to stuff that works, which is drugs. But the drugs just mask it. So and this is what some of the psychologists we've been discussing this. There's a subtle shift more towards psychiatry, where you just load the person up with drugs in order to mask the problems or to get them under control, rather than actually curing the problem. Whereas, as I mentioned, in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, people can actually change their brain chemistry back by performing the right kinds of behavior. So if people just lead good moral Catholic lives, if you raise your children with good moral Catholic lives, they are less likely to suffer psychological illness, and so are you. Because why? It will perfect you intellectually. Because why? Faith is something that's infused in the intellect. St. Thomas calls it the first purification of the intellect, because it purifies our understanding of God, and as a result, it purifies our understanding of ourselves in relationship to Him and things of this sort. So if you lead just a good moral Catholic life, you probably won't need to see a psychologist ever. And then I'll just end with this. There are some really good Catholic psychologists. The psychological books that I've written are written and based from St. Thomas's point of view. And they tend to follow this. And they have a phenomenal success rate. Not because I wrote it. They were having phenomenal success rates because they were following St. Thomas before they even met me. But the upshot of it is they usually recognize that if people would just return, particularly Catholics. Oh, by the way, you do know that before Vatican II, now it's not because of Vatican II, but before Vatican II, because of the outlet of confession, there were less Catholics in mental institutions than any other denomination in this country. After Vatican II, there are now more Catholics in mental institutions than any other denomination. Well, that tells you if you lead a Catholic life, you're less likely to have psychological difficulties. But the psychologist said to me, he said, if people were leading good Catholic lives, there probably wouldn't be any need for us, that is, the good Catholic psychologists, who follow a Thomistic understanding and not the empirical method. Most of them would jump through the hoops in order to get it because they knew it was all nonsense in order to get out there, and they have a high success rate. But and I said, not necessarily. You will need you for the more extreme cases. But as to 99% of the cases, you're right. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death.
Our Lady of Divine Grace, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Okay, so this conference is on the there's kind of an interim stage, but there's the 4 stages of attachments and what happens to people through the course of their life on how God structured us and how it affects our ability to make attachments and break attachments. And this is important because there's a time frame. Each one of these has specific characteristics that are important for us to know. The first one is just basically infancy. It's, when you're a small child under the age of 5. So, infancy, there you go. So, infancy, one of the things that they've discovered with, in modern psychology, not everything in modern psychology is bad, most of it is, but not all of it's bad, is that before the age of about 2 or 3, and definitely before 5, it's necessary for the bonding between the mother and the child, or parents, but usually the mother and the child,
in order for the child to, and that usually comes in the form of empathy, where the mother empathizes with the things that hurt him, etc., that there has to be that emotional bond. Because if they don't develop that at infancy, then what happens is they end up with what's called disaffective disorder. They can't emotionally connect with people. So there actually has to be initially, and it's not an attachment in the full sense, because it's not conscious or volitional, but it is that there is an attachment in the sense of the child is inclined emotionally towards the mother and to be bonded with her. And that is, as I mentioned, is a necessary thing. This is one of the reasons why the daycare system is so dangerous. I think I mentioned to you sometime in the past, but there was a psychologist who I know who did an initial study and investigated all these people that do mass shootings that are under the age of 25. The older ones, it's another matter, but the ones under 25. And she's found out that the only thing they had in common was daycare. Most of them have already been in therapy or had been in therapy or thought they needed therapy. But the point being is that this disaffective disorder means they can't emotionally connect, and so when you get hurt, they don't have any emotional response in relationship to that, and that's why they can go in and just mow people down and it doesn't faze them, right? This attachment is actually a necessary thing in the process of actually having right order. Historically, of course, if you look at the spiritual theology, historically, we tend to think of attachments as bad. And actually, not all attachments are bad. They're just not perfect. In other words, some attachments are actually rightly ordered in the sense that they're ordered towards something that's authentically good, right? It's just that the attachments tend to drive us towards immoderation, or the attachment to the thing is more than it actually should be. And that's a key point, because in the beginning stages of infancy, there's that initial attachment that the children develop in relationship to their parents. Then, but as I mentioned, it's not fully voluntary. In fact, it's not voluntary at all, because they're just doing it as the way our brain is structured. And it's a product of two faculties. The first is the emotions. So the emotions have this inclination towards that individual in a good way. And then the other one is in the cogitative power, with the other individual associated something good. And so that association is a necessary thing for us in order to develop properly on a psychological level, that is, on a natural level. So much like the first stage of the spiritual life, you don't immediately set out working on perfecting the theological virtues, although you do that too. Your primary thing is to remove defects by developing natural virtue. So the natural virtue inclines you to relate to certain things on a natural level in a certain way. And it's the same thing with this attachments that you develop as an infancy. It helps the person to have a right order in relationship to other people. Now, is it perfect? No. That's what's going to happen later. Okay. The next stage is between the age of about, it's actually between the ages of 10 and 14. We could, pubescence basically, but in this stage, something very key happens. After you go through the age of reason, which is usually between about 6 and 7, although some kids it's earlier, that's why that's when a person is starting able to make acts of conscience and therefore choice of the will. There's some initial things that are going on there. You can't develop virtue perfectly before you go through puberty. And the reason being is because of the fact that your acts aren't fully voluntary. And St. Thomas says is that virtue is voluntary, which means what? Well, we know this from our own common experience. If people force us to do something all the time, like if the parents force the kids to be obedient, do the children develop obedience? No. They're just externally complying, because it's not in accord with their will necessarily. So it's only when the child makes the choice to be obedient does he actually develop the virtue of obedience, right? Or we see this with all the other virtues. And they used to say it's virtue in the absence of vice was a phrase they used to have, which basically means that the person doesn't really have any virtue, he just doesn't have any vice in that area because he's never had any choice to be basically able to develop it. Okay. So what does this all mean concretely? It just means that once you become the age of reason, between 5 and 7 somewhere, and up until about 10, there's not a full development of the virtues. As a result of that, there's not a development of the attachments fully. In other words, the attachment, what is an attachment? It's something in the cogitative power or the emotions, actually can be also in the intellect and will. But it's when the person makes a choice in relationship to a thing, and in that choice that he makes in relationship to that thing, he chooses to pursue that thing or attach himself to it. That process of making that choice and attaching himself to it means that he is orienting or directing his faculties. So if you remember in the infancy, it's the proper relationship he develops with his mother primarily that helps him to develop that orientation of his faculties in relationship to other people. This then is the next stage in which that becomes, once the person goes from 10 to 14, that's the stage where the person goes through puberty, and so their choices can become fully volitional. And in that process, that means that that's the time in which the attachments become developed and also solidified. It's a key thing because it's at this period that people are basically determining the things that they're going to be, that the virtues and vices that are going to be easier based upon their choices, and the things they're going to struggle with for the rest of their life, literally, unless that attachment is broken, which requires a brutal process. So it's in this period that through your choices, you're orienting your faculties either on how they're going to relate to things, because it becomes fully voluntary, and that's why you had to develop virtue in relationship to it. This attachment, though, is something which, and this is just a standard or a general observation, and that is what the attachments that the person develops in that stage, as I mentioned, is what they're going to struggle with the rest of their life. I'm going to just give you a few examples. It's during that stage that if a young man develops chastity volitionally, the chastity becomes much easier later in his life. But if he starts developing an attachment to pleasure at that stage, that attachment then is something that he has to struggle with almost the rest of his life, even in the form in which he does it. But it's something he's going to struggle with the rest of his life, unless he does specific things, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But that's something that it becomes solidified at that stage, and then later one asks himself why. Now, part of this, again, is because the cogitative power is being habituated to look at something in a specific way, which means it's being trained. That means that a lot of times it's the stuff that they develop at this stage sometimes takes a lifetime to untrain this thing, right? Because all it's doing, when it's in infancy, it's just the cogitative power is making the associations based on externals, primarily, in his emotional states. But at 10 to 14, he's making a choice, and so the cogitative power is being confirmed in its associations. And once it becomes confirmed, it's a long process to unconfirm that. Another example is that you'll see is if in the stage of infancy, if somebody is, and this is something that I deal with quite a bit, if people are like, you see this mostly with women, if they're molested or raped or something at this age, the cogitative power's ability to process things properly is trained or formed in such a way that, and we call it a wound, that they can't process things properly. So that unless this gets kind of straightened out before they go through puberty, it's something which is going to take a long time for them to heal from. Another example, and so, but that how they process that injustice in the beginning, how they're helped to process that, especially as they go through puberty, is going to determine how they're going to process it the rest of their life. So, for example, one of the things is you'll come across people who are, something traumatic happens in their infancy, and through when they go through their 10 to 14, that age, there's a series of choices they make on how they're going to relate to that, and that's going to determine how they're going to relate to other people. The most common one that I've seen is that when that happens to women, at this stage, if they're unable to process it properly, they end up in one of two states, usually. The first is kind of this depression where they assume a victimhood, kind of a response to it. The other kind is, and so they just, their whole life, they just feel victimized by people, and they can't really get healed through that process. The other one is they get the mindset as, I'm not going to put up with injustice, period. Then we'll see in the next stage, so they said, I'm not going to put up with injustice, and so there's this hardness that sets in as a result of it. And that hardness, or that wall, is what blocks them from being able to have intimacy with other people. In the third stage, then what happens is, if something happens to them traumatically after 14, and they have this idea of, I'm not going to suffer that injustice, when they go through this third stage, they become what I call injustice collectors. They're constantly looking to foresee to people that are there causing these problems with injustice. Another example of this is how, and I see this most often, with how, we'll give two more examples. One is how men or young boys relate to their father. So if they relate to their father in a specific way, that is, if their relationship during this period, they have a proper father-son relationship, then what happens is that after that, the attachment to masculinity, to be like the father, becomes something that becomes very predominant. And so they actually want to develop a properly ordered masculinity. Whereas if it's not, if there's the relationship with the father is very rocky, people can work their way out of it based upon their decisions. That's not a problem. But most people, going the way of all flesh, will end up, guys will become very effeminate and very soft. We're seeing this even in our own culture with all the effeminacy. The next example I'm going to give is in relationship to something that I see commonly, fairly commonly, in fact, with young girls or women in this stage between 10 and 14 and their mothers. So what happens is, if the relationship with their mother is such that during this stage they perceive or constantly perceive injustice on the side of their mother, if they don't make the proper choices and they make the decision, I'm not going to suffer this injustice, what I've seen this happen is that they end up carrying it into their marriage. And so they refuse to suffer the injustice in relationship to their husband. And so basically the relationship that you're supposed to have with your father and your mother during this stage, which is supposed to be the one in which the formative aspects of intimacy occur, how to be intimate with people in a right and ordered way, gets derailed. And a lot of when I've talked with people about this, they tend to think, oh, well, that's not always the case. Yeah, it's not always the case, but it is most of the time. And so it's the decisions, what they make between 10 and 14, the decisions they make at that stage in relationship to their mother at that particular point is going to literally determine how they're going to relate with other people for the rest of their lives. So they have to make that decision now. This is one of the reasons why it's so key to get people to develop an ability to suffer well. The Jesuits used to say, give me someone until the age of their 12 and you can have them the rest of their life. The Jesuits already knew there were these two stages. The first is that this training of the cogitative power with what is good and what is bad was the foundation for the child to be able to process it after that about what's morally right and wrong. Because the associations of this thing is bad or this thing is good, when it's developed before that, once he starts making choices after he gets between 5 and 7 and older, he's basing it on these associations that he's already have. Whereas if there's no associations made, which basically means proper attachments to the good and not to evil, aren't made, the kid's going to end up directionless when he gets into this age where he's basically has no moral compass. Again, this is one of the reasons why daycares are so dangerous. Because in 99% of the daycares out there, there's no moral formation of the children. In fact, it's the opposite. The kid is thrown into a situation that's traumatic, and then what happens is he develops all these fears, etc. And then through the course of this, he ends up, becoming angry or bitter with other kids, or the kids are beating each other up to steal toys from each other, and nobody's paying that much attention to him. And so the kid basically, develops this inability to emotionally relate to people. Another one that you see commonly developed between 10 and 14 is fear. People will develop these attachments to certain things, and then when they're afraid of getting hurt or things like that, and they don't develop that ability to suffer well, and this can also happen if there's something traumatic in infancy, that fear ends up getting stuck with them for the rest of their life. They have something they have to keep processing for a long period of time. And what this basically means is that the way God structured our brains is to have this initial formation, but then the solidification in what you're going to do morally right and wrong is going to happen between the ages of 10 and 14. This is why, my dad even just said it to me just recently. He said, yeah, most of the time after kids go through puberty, that's pretty much what you're going to see the rest of your life. And I think this is something to keep in mind. This is a choice, like this is an important time frame, because it tells you I can really determine how easy the rest of my spiritual life and moral life is going to be by the choices I make there. Okay. A lot of times when kids are at this age, though, it's kind of like, well, no, it's because of this one person. Once I'm out of that, then I'm going to not have to deal with this in my future. That is completely false, because you're already habituating your faculties, and so you're going to take that habituation with you, whether it's that one person or not. And so you have to really work on that. And that's, by the way, not just for bad or for good. I mean, it's one of those things that this is one of the reasons why how a man responds to chastity during this stage is likely to determine how he's going to develop, how he's going to be able to deal with that as he gets older. Another thing that you see, I've kind of started noticing very subtly, is if during this stage, I notice it more with old people than with younger people. If during this stage, men, I haven't seen it in women at least, during this stage, this is the time when guys become voracious, usually. They'll eat the parents out of house and home, usually, right? And if there is, like, a restriction in the food supply by natural means, the parents just don't have a whole lot of money, a lot of times the men can develop a fear, a very subtle fear about not eating something when it's presented to them. And in other words, when it's there, there's kind of like this fear of losing out, because I might not get it next time, right? So that I've actually seen that get developed there, and it's something that can affect people all the way until they're dead, literally. This is a key time, and this is one of the reasons why how they develop it here is really important. This is also one of the reasons why the church, I think wisely, is starting to move, at least some bishops, move the age of confirmation back to 10. Because at that stage, the children are giving the extra graces to make better decisions. Okay. The third stage is between the ages of 18 and 25. And we're going to call this the coming of age stage. After you've developed these 10 to 14, this is the stage in which your attachments, in other words, even though these are going to probably affect you the rest of your life, it's at this stage that certain decisions have to be made to move past your attachments. It's at this stage that you have to say, I got to give up the stuff that I was attached to when I was younger. I got to give up the stuff of my youth, basically. And I have to be able to move on. In other words, this is the stage in which people make concrete decisions to start growing up, right? And that's, and by growing up, I mean in the sense of, I'm going to start maturing, I'm going to start working on virtue, I'm going to start putting these other things aside, I'm going to be willing to suffer, etc., and not just be kind of beholden to my appetites. And the reason I started noticing this has to do with an article I want to write, so I'm just going to put it out on verbal form, and then I don't have to write the article. But basically it was just called Time Warp, right? We've been told for 50 years now that the church has to modernize. It has to kind of come up to speed in relationship to the modern world. This is the mantra of the guys that were trained in the seminaries in the 40s and 50s, who then became the generation that begot Vatican II. They made a conscious decision at some stage. By conscious, I mean not fully reflected, but they made a conscious decision that this is what they wanted. In effect, that generation of priests and bishops, in large part, not all of them obviously, in large part, made the decision never to grow up. And how do I say that? It's easy. Look at what they still promote. All of the problems that they keep talking about are still problems of the 60s. They came of age of the 60s. We're not talking about, if it's true that you should be coming up to the modern, that the church should adapt itself to the times, why is it that literally every single thing in the church, other than the traditional movement, is stuck in 1962 to 1965? So the problems that they're still dealing with are from the 60s. The liturgy is still from the 60s. We're still dealing with something that is, something in which they They don't want this thing to go away. I mean, we just heard recently that, the reform of the reform is never going to happen, right? This thing's not going to be reformed. And why is that? It's because of the fact that they're still stuck at this time frame in their life when they came of age and never really grew up. And remember, this is also during the time of the primary intellectual formation of somebody. So it's how people are formed at this stage. This is one of the reasons why all the communism, as Bella Dodd showed in the book School of Darkness, all the communism now that's rife in our education system, these kids are not going to probably change because they came of age at a time in which their formation was essentially communist. Now, I'm talking about right now. Okay. Another example is the vestments. The vestments that they wear are still burlap. They're still from the 60s. It's still the stuff you saw in the 60s. Some of it, you see the little stoles with the little handprints, and they think that's cute, right? I mean, it's the whole thing, right? The music is still from the 60s. They can't seem to get past this formation. When Pope Benedict actually made the changes to the translation, they just threw they had a fit over it because they're still stuck in this time frame. They're also still stuck in that time frame about, as I mentioned, problems in the church, etc. So the liturgy is still from the 60s. All these things are still from the 60s. Their sermons are still from the 60s. I mean, you still listen to them and they're just like, really? Can't you kind of come up to speed? They also can't understand because when they came of age, they made this decision to not grow up, essentially. I mean, quite frankly, part of growing up is the ability to admit you're wrong, right? We've had 50 years where they've kept this track, and all it's done is slowly take the church down, and they can't bring themselves to admit they're wrong. They haven't grown up, a lot of them. And this is one of the things that we're seeing. This coming of age, as I mentioned, is the time, and that's why St. Paul, I think it was St. Paul, and correct me, he says, when I was a child, I acted like a child, and I behaved like a child, but then when I became an adult, I put the things of the childhood away. He's basically talking about there's this period where your attachments to the things of your youth have to essentially die in order for you to move on, to be able to continue that growth in the spiritual life. This is also the time frame. So here's where the virtues, the virtue starts to really begin in 10 and 14. But it's at the stage of 18 to 25 that there's something that happens to us as human beings that requires that because we're now on our own, the decisions are less, what do my parents think? What of this? It's I'm now taking full responsibility for myself, and at this stage, this means if I'm going to keep moving forward, the things of my youth have to be put away. Okay. We also know that this is also true here, and these things can be stymied. So there's two things that can block. They know through modern psychological studies, again, it's one of those legitimate things, they know through modern psychological studies there's two things that can block a person's emotional development. The first is trauma. When people go through a traumatic event at that stage, it's at that point that their emotional life stops developing. And the reason it stops developing is because of the fact that the person essentially can't, because to emotionally develop, there's a certain suffering that's required in the process in order to emotionally develop. But they've had this tremendous suffering to such a degree that they can't process it properly, and so as a result of that, they can't engage in the other sufferings that are necessary in order to continue developing. You'll see this all the time. In fact, I was mentioning it the other day. I knew a priest who had been traumatized when he was really young. And as a result of that, on certain levels he seemed to mature, but when you got to know him, you began to realize that he would basically act like a 5-year-old under certain circumstances, right? And emotionally, as you got to know him, you began to realize that because of this trauma, he hadn't gotten beyond this 5-year-old stage in how he related to people emotionally and psychologically, because he didn't develop. The other thing that stunts the growth is dissipation into pleasure. In other words, when people become attached to specific pleasures in life, they never get beyond that stage of growing up. Okay, so what happens is their emotional life gets stunted. This is one of the reasons why boys between the ages of 10 and 14 who don't master chastity you'll find that when you're dealing with them, even when they're 25 or 30, if they're still struggling with this chastity problem, their emotional states is still 10 to 14. You're also seeing it with things like video games. Now, I'm not saying video games are evil, but they're like anything else. They have to be moderated. So what happens is kids, they'll let the kids between 10 and 14 play hours and hours and hours and hours of video games, and then by the time the kid's 25, he's still playing hours and hours and hours of video games because his emotional life has been stunted at that age. I'm not suggesting that they can't be legitimate recreation, but it's like any other thing, it has to be moderated, okay, as part of the sub-virtue of eutropalia, which, as you know, is one of my favorites, okay, as far as virtues. The point being is that this is that attachment to pleasure is what's going to stunt the process of moving forward. This tells us something very key about our development of our spiritual life, and that is attachments are always to something good. And by that I mean there's something good that the person's getting out of it. And so the pleasure that a person gets out of it, if he can't put that pleasure aside he's never going to break that attachment. Or if he doesn't break the attachment, he can't advance spiritually. He can't mature properly. The converse of that is also true. If he's been traumatized, or if he doesn't work on being willing to suffer, and that basically means to not get the thing that you're attached to. Because let's face it, the reason that we don't want to suffer is because we're attached to our own comfort. We're attached to ourselves. And it's only through that process of going through the suffering that we're able to break that attachment. So he's got to work on being willing to suffer well and to be put aside the pleasure, right, in order to actually properly mature. But this age of 18 to 25 is a key point where a person starts to, again, takes responsibility for themselves, and then at that stage, they're going to have to confirm or deny all this stuff, and they're going to have to be willing to put aside all these things from their past. The last stage, there is kind of an interim stage, at about the age of 30 to 33. This is a stage in which you've kind of peaked in your growth, actually, physiologically and otherwise. And so you stop, and now you're on the downhill side, as many of us older people can testify. And that's a stage in which your emotions, if you're pursuing virtue with any kind of, desire or any kind of strength, your emotional life will start to pan out. It'll mellow out at that stage, right? But the only way it'll start to mellow out at that stage is if you've made the right decisions between the ages of 18 and 25 to be willing to put aside, to heal in relationship to any wounds that you might have, and be willing to suffer. So, and this is kind of a key stage, and this is where things kind of mellow out. This is one of the reasons why we resurrect at 33. Because we've kind of reached that stage of perfection in a certain sense where the emotional life kind of pans out. This is, but it's kind of an interim stage. The last stage is old age. And one of the things that happens in old age is that the cogitative power, and the emotions too, but primarily the cogitative power, becomes locked in the things that it has been associated with. And by that I mean in the sense that you see this with older people. By older people, I mean people like in their 70s and 80s. The way they've behaved their whole life, if they haven't mastered it or crushed it or conquered it, when they get to that stage, it becomes so solidified they find it almost impossible to change. In fact, they don't bother changing. They're just completely locked into that. My grandfather was telling me this one story. He was laughing about it. He says, he was telling me, he says, you really do die the way you live. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, he knew this one guy that would just cuss like a sailor all the time, right? When he was dying, he was cussing right up to the last breath. All right. The point being is that it's that stage you see, once you reach old age, if you haven't conquered this stuff in the past. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that after 25 that you can't make that change. It's just much more difficult, right? Because it's by degrees of voluntariness, right? So in the infancy, there's practically no voluntariness. There's only partial voluntariness in the second stage. In the third stage, that's when it becomes fully voluntary, and that's why it becomes solidified. And that's why certain decisions need to be made, right? But when you get to the old age, it's ossification. I mean, you're just locked into this thing, and it's going to be very difficult to make the changes. It can still be done with grace, I do know of a woman who recognized a particular problem she had when she got into her mid to late 70s and really worked hard at it and did a pretty decent job of overcoming at least parts of the difficulty that she had struggled with. But usually that's not the case. Usually people kind of become more solidified in that stage, and then as a result of that, and their attachments to certain things become much more solidified in that stage. Whereas if you're able to conquer your attachments, like in this stage, and you work on those attachments all through your life, and you basically overcome them, by the time you get to the old age, and you can see this in certain older people, there's a kindness, a natural kindness, not force. It's not something you have to work at. There's a kind of a charity. There's a kind of a benignity in relationship to people. They don't really care one way or another. Sometimes even if they get their meal or not. They're very peaceful as a result of this. And so that's a sign that they've kind of mastered this. Whereas the people who haven't, when they get older, that's when you see them getting cantankerous or difficult, or when they've been critical of people all their life, they find that that my parent is still critical, etc. So you'll see that becoming solidified. But this, again, all of us are in different stages of this thing. Although sometimes I feel like I'm in stage 4 here, old age. But the point being is that these are different stages in which how our attachments develop. We have to be aware of it. This is what I'm dealing with if I'm going to actually end up conquering it. Okay. Any questions, comments, observations? I'm depressed now. Yes.
So I was in that 10 to 14 age group, like you mentioned in infancy, how daycare is so bad, and in the 10 to 14, where your conscience is being formed, if it's being formed by really violent video games all the time, or the television set where you spend most of your day.
Right.
That's pretty critical, I think.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is also a sign of that the mother needs to be home, huh? Because it's during this stage that if the child's going to start making voluntary decisions and developing virtue, one of which is prudence, you need the mother home to help the kid process it, generally, right? I mean, even though most kids will just blow off their parents, in point in fact, if they're trying to gain virtue, there's going to be time they're just going to realize they're going to have to go to their parents and ask them how to process this. But just the parents being home helps the kids to keep that processing, whereas when the parents are just gone, the kid's there to run amok, and if he doesn't have anything in the infancy, he's just got no moral compass. Yes?
We have some relatives now where the girl is now 14 and she just started high school, and our whole family has noticed that the mother has always been very harsh towards her and things like that.
Yeah.
And they both seem to have a melancholic primary disposition, choleric secondary, and you see she's very sweet to people, and she's apparently been having some real issues with anger where she'll lash out at other siblings and things like that.
Right.
But the dynamic is also like in most marriages where the mother really dominates the husband, who's a really wonderful guy and things like that, but she's kind of saying things to him about this child that aren't really true necessarily. Like basically all the onus is on this child, and so even the dad's almost turning against her and things like that, but she just doesn't know how to process the fact that she has basically no mercy in the home. So what are her prospects if her mom doesn't change? Like, and how should she deal with that too? Because even my uncle was like, Emily never has a problem being obedient to me. She loves, doing what I do, but like, she doesn't want to obey the mother because she's never really treated well.
Yeah.
So.
I wrote this in my chapter. There's a chapter in my book in psychology called implicit learning. And basically what it is it's a function of the cogitative power, which when certain things happen, how the parents react in relationship to that trains the cogitative power on how to react, even assessing it to such a degree that it will actually cause specific emotions. Okay. So when the mother is not merciful in any way, or she's just merciless, what happens is it trains the cogitative power so that when a person gets into a situation like that where someone's they're being affected by somebody, their tendency is going to be to become merciless to them. It's just going to be a natural reaction. In fact, you hear people say, I can't believe I've become like my mother or something, or my father or whatever. So, and this is a kind of an implicit learning. Basically what it means is that at that stage, when virtue's being developed, there has to be a psychological separation made to where the person is able to see, well, look, how my mother reacts to this is not necessarily the proper way. And then they have to be able to, but they usually need somebody to help them process that. So, and that it usually means in learning that, don't take things personally, it's not you, it's how she's relating to you, etc., so that you can actually look at it in a more objective way so that you don't get the emotional responses in relationship to it. And then you yourself have to, once you see what the truth of it is, you have to act according to that to develop the opposite virtue. See, the beauty of it is when people are raised in a rightly ordered way is that the cogitative part of the emotions all get there's a right order that they're trained in, so that when they get on their own feet, they can advance very rapidly. This is why you see certain kids when they grow up in certain families, and they get out on their own, they might struggle a little bit, but then they very quickly start advancing in virtue on their own. It's not too common, but you see it. But it also means that, and I don't want to be like the hippies who blame their parents for everything, because we have to take responsibility for ourselves too, is the fact that we take that training that our parents gave to us for good or ill, right? But that means that, like anything else, okay, well then that just means that I have these defects and I got to start working on them, and I can't be blaming my parents because I'm adult right now. I always tell people I tell people that he would say, basically being an exorcist is basically being the one who changes the diapers of the church, right? And we didn't soil the thing, but it's our job to clean it up, right? It's the same thing with our own lives. We, at a certain stage, it might be that our parents bequeath us good virtues, but then also certain habits that aren't so good. But that doesn't mean at a certain stage you can start blaming At a certain stage, you can't blame your parents anymore because you are making choices to act this way, and you are the one solidifying this vice, and it's your responsibility. So you might not have been the cause, but it doesn't mean that it's not your responsibility to clean it up. And with her, what she needs to do is find somebody who can help her make that psychological separation to look at things more objectively so that she can begin that processing in relationship to it. It also means that she has to just learn to suffer other people well, because that's one of the other things is that, when you see this with parents who are really meek, when the parents are really meek, they're never lashing out at people, but they're really meek, what you find is that the kids just naturally, when somebody lashes at them, have an automatic response of meekness, right? It's an automatic kind of a thing. And so the only time they'll kind of get raised up is if they realize they can't get this person to calm down, right? So it becomes, in other words, that training is so key. And this is one of the reasons why as parents, you're taking your problems into the marriage with you, right? So, and with your kids. And this is one of the reasons why you should be in the unitive way before you get married. No. You need to really work on your own virtues and vices. This is even true, I tell people all the time, and this is something that's really key, is if you have an emotion, an antecedent emotion that you don't have control of, it doesn't matter who's out there or who's causing it or anything. That is irrelevant. The problem is you've got a problem internally. That's why Christ said, don't look at the speck in the other person, look at the plank in your own. He's trying to constantly get us to look at our defects. My emotional response is a problem in me. It doesn't matter what this person's doing ultimately as to whether I'm culpable for my response or not. And so what I need to do is, if I'm experiencing things, then I need to get the focus shifted to myself and figure out how I'm going to deal with this, right? And so with her, that's, I think, one of the things I do is just say, okay, look, put aside the fact that this happened with your mom. This is what we need to do to get you to where you need to be.
A tangential question is, do you find that these issues become worse through the generations if they're not properly dealt with? Like, it's never just like this problem maintains this level of awfulness, and then it maintains the same level of awfulness in the next generation. Do you think that it gets exacerbated?
I find it splits. So what you'll do is, there's a branch of it that gets worse over the course of time. But then there's a certain branch that, because of the suffering involved, it just kind of breaks down and they just don't pursue that vice. In other words, the mercilessness, the kid just loses, he becomes discouraged, and so he's not merciless. He just doesn't really affect him that much. Sometimes too, kids will just say, I'm not going to have the same problem as these particular problems with my parents. On the other hand, part of the difficulty is especially once the kids go through puberty and all the way up until they're about 25, is the perception, because it's at that stage that we get a certain kind of intellectual clarity. But there's that intellectual clarity then can give people a false sense that they can judge things accurately. St. Thomas, or the whole moral tradition, talks about the fact that you need a series of memories in order to be able to look back and judge the proper thing to do in its given set of circumstances. We call that experience. So you have to have that if you're going to be able to judge things. And I think the mistake with kids at this stage is that they think that they know when they don't have sufficient experience, etc. So what will happen, though, is that certain kids at that stage, though, will also just say, look, I'm not going to get sucked into this problem that my particular parent has. Now, the danger with that is it ends up in one of two things. They can either just completely separate from their parents and never have anything to do with their parents, or they can just say, okay, my parent had this problem. They can have a certain benignity towards it and just realize it's just something I got to work on to make sure I don't end up in that same boat. So one of the things that I learned about demons in the last 2 months, or about 3 months, is something I just formulated. Something I noticed, but I just kind of formulated it, which is every single interaction that they have with anybody, they take personally. It's completely personal. Whereas, with the people in heaven, it's not personal, because it's all about God, right? It's not about them, it's about God. So when the demons made their choice, it was completely selfish, and that means they are constantly looking at things self-referentially. How does this person relate to me, right? And so the demons are willing to cut certain people off or do certain things in relationship to other people because of how they relate to them, rather than being able to look past that, because they can't do that, because everything's personal. Whereas human beings, we have to look past the treatment that we're getting from somebody and look at what's best for that person spiritually. It's difficult, but we can do that. And ironically, in our lifetime, we will become either like the demons, where everything's personal in relationship to people, or it's going to become like the people in heaven, where everything is just about God. It's one or the other. It's never going to be, a medium ground, because there is no medium ground, right? It's either about God or it's about us. And so, in relationship to our parents or anything like that, when it's about God, there's a benignity that we can have towards people and their difficulties and what they're struggling with. So, yes.
How does one break attachments, or is that for the sexual?
Yeah, that's a whole different conference. It's a pretty involved conference. But basically, the principal way is it starts and is founded in the will making the choice to turn away from that good to which it's attached. That's the foundational part of it, repeatedly, and letting loose of it. And there's different attachments, as I mentioned, so that's usually the principal way. The other thing to always remember, too, is that, what we struggle with through the 10 to 14, I think that one of the things, there's something I want to mention about this period between 10 and 14. What we struggle with during that time frame, even if we're struggling with it and we manage to keep ourselves, we manage to conquer it to some degree where we're not falling into it, etc., and we're still fighting it through that period, it means that when we get into the later stages, it'll be either conquered or it'll be easier to conquer. It's when you give yourself over to the thing that's where the problem starts. So what happens when we're struggling with stuff at that stage, we can still conquer it. And it also doesn't mean that if this thing we get stuck with some attachment during this stage that we can't break it later. It just means it's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done in order to get all these faculties redirected. That's the real problem, is getting it all directed. You can get your mind and intellect and will directed, but then you still got this cogitative power and emotions that are still all over the map, right? So the point being is that don't get discouraged and just realize, even in old age, with grace, you can still conquer these things. But to answer your question directly, it's primarily the turning away of the will on a repeated basis, and then trying to look at the thing from a perspective that will help you to see that I shouldn't have this attachment, or I should look at it this way, rather than the view of the attachment. That's how the emotions are trained. Looking at it from the point of view of how the attachment isn't rightly ordered, and that takes a little bit of time. So there's essentially 2 stages. The first is you got to get your mind off the thing and tell your lower faculties no, the will, which is the will turning away from it. Then the second stage is looking at it differently. And then that will cause the attachments. Sometimes these things almost happen instantaneously, right? where something will happen to us and we'll see something so clearly that our attachments and relationships to this thing's just broken, right? It's almost like a grace. You're just like, okay, that's enough of that, right? Okay. All right, well, since there's no more questions, if you'll kneel, I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, super vos et semper.